There is a population in northern Japan that has puzzled outsiders for over a century. The Ainu of Hokkaido don't look like any other population in East Asia. Deeper set eyes, thicker beards, broader noses, features that for generations made Western scientists reach the same conclusion. They classified the Ainu as Caucasian, a lost European race somehow stranded at the edge of the Pacific. But DNA investigations from the past decade tell a very different story. Whole genome sequencing now suggests the Ainu carry almost no European ancestry at all. Their deepest genetic roots trace to an ancient East Asian lineage that split off roughly 20,000 years ago. The resemblance wasn't European. It was something far older. For at least 15,000 years, the ancestors of the Ainu were the only people living on these islands. They're called the Genome, named after the cord-marked pottery they left across the entire Japanese archipelago, and the pottery itself is among the oldest on Earth, some fragments dating back 14,000 years. But the real breakthrough came when geneticists finally extracted DNA from Genome-era skeletal remains. The first piece of evidence came from a genome-wide comparison published in 2012. Researchers plotted Ainu genomes against dozens of global populations, and the Ainu didn't cluster anywhere near Europeans. They fell squarely within the East Asian branch, closer to populations in Siberia and Southeast Asia than to anyone in Europe. The migration routes told the same story. The ancestors of the Ainu traveled northeast from mainland East Asia, not west from Europe. The second evidence piece locked the finding deeper. Their Y chromosome haplogroup. Ainu men overwhelmingly carry haplogroup D, a lineage found in Tibet, the Andaman Islands, and scattered across East Asia, but virtually absent in Europe. Thousands of miles apart, separated by ocean and mountain, the Ainu and Tibetan Highlanders share a paternal ancestor that no European population carries. And the third piece of evidence changed the timeline entirely. In 2019, a team led by Takashi Gakuhari published the most complete Genome genome ever sequenced. The DNA came from a woman buried in a cave on the coast of Honshu, a Genome individual who lived roughly 3,800 years ago. Her genome showed zero detectable European or Western Eurasian ancestry, and a direct genetic line to the modern Ainu. The face of the Genome looked nothing like the European ideal that colonial anthropologists imagined. But it wasn't just one genome. The pattern repeated across dozens of ancient samples from sites spanning the length of the archipelago. From Hokkaido to Kyushu to the Ryukyu Islands, the Genome genetic signature appeared everywhere. Even on Okinawa, over 2,000 kilometers south of Hokkaido, ancient remains carried the same Genome ancestry that links directly to the Ainu. The Genome were in a small isolated pocket. They were the original population of the entire Japanese island chain, and the features that made Europeans call them Caucasian weren't borrowed from the West. They were inherited from a lineage that predates any contact with Europe by tens of thousands of years. So, if the Ainu weren't European, what exactly made a century of scientists so certain they were? The answer lies not in the Ainu themselves, but in the framework their observers brought with them. In the 1800s, European anthropologists operated under a rigid racial classification system. Every population had to fit into a predetermined category. When they measured Ainu skulls and found shapes that didn't match East Asian norms, they didn't consider convergent evolution. They reached for the only explanation their framework allowed. These people must be white. But even the photographs from that era tell a different story. The Ainu were far more physically diverse than the classification suggested. Modern genetics has a term for what actually happened: convergent evolution. Similar environments can produce similar physical traits through entirely separate genetic pathways. No shared ancestry required. The cold northern climate of Hokkaido likely selected for some of the same facial features that evolved independently in northern Europe. Deeper eye sockets, more prominent brow ridges, thicker body hair. Different genes, similar outcomes. The Ainu's thick beards and deep-set eyes trace to entirely different alleles. than European ones. The Genome face wasn't European. It was uniquely its own, shaped by 20,000 years of isolation on a volcanic archipelago. But here is the twist. The Ainu aren't a genetically frozen time capsule from the Ice Age. Modern Ainu genomes show significant admixture, roughly 20 to 30% of their DNA traces, not to the Genome, but to the Yayoi migrants who arrived from the Korean peninsula around 300 BCE. The Yayoi brought rice farming, bronze tools, and a continental genome that would eventually dominate the main islands. And wherever the Yayoi settled, the genetic signature of the Jomon began to fade, replaced, absorbed, diluted over centuries of mixing. On mainland Japan today, only about 10 to 20% of the average genome traces back to the Jomon. But in Hokkaido, the Ainu retain roughly 70%. Not because they were isolated completely, but because the Yayoi expansion reached them last and least. And that distinction between pure Jomon survival and partial mixing matters because it complicates the one thing colonial anthropologists wanted most: a clean racial category. The Ainu weren't a lost white tribe, but they also weren't a perfectly preserved ancient people untouched by time. They were something more complicated, a living population shaped by the same forces of migration and mixing that shaped everyone else on these islands. So where does that leave the old classification? And what does the deeper science actually show? The deepest investigation into Ainu origins came from a team at the National Museum of Nature and Science in Tokyo. Hideki Kanzawa Kiriyama and his colleagues sequenced ancient DNA from Jomon-era individuals found at multiple sites across Japan. The petrous bone, the densest bone in the human body, yielded enough intact DNA for whole genome sequencing. The results confirmed the pattern. Modern Ainu genomes are majority Jomon, but with measurable continental admixture layered on top. The divergent state came back between 18,000 and 25,000 years ago, placing the split firmly in the last ice age. During the last glacial maximum, when sea levels were more than 100 meters lower, the ancestors of the Jomon walked from the Asian mainland onto the Japanese archipelago. And once sea levels rose, those populations were cut off, locked onto the islands with limited gene flow for thousands of years. A second major study from the Riken Center for Integrative Medical Sciences pushed the analysis further in 2020. Their three-dimensional analysis showed the Ainu sitting on a genetic gradient between ancient Jomon and modern mainland Japanese, not between East Asian and European. The European connection wasn't just wrong, it had never existed. The genetic data eliminated it from every angle, but perhaps the most surprising finding came from a population over 2,000 kilometers to the south, the Ryukyuan people of Okinawa. Despite being separated by the entire length of the archipelago, the Ainu and Ryukyuan people share a remarkably similar genetic signature, both carrying significantly more Jomon ancestry than mainland Japanese. The Ryukyuan connection confirmed what the Jomon genome had already implied. The original population of Japan wasn't just in the north, they were everywhere, and the Yayoi expansion compressed them to the margins, the far north and the far south, where continental migration reached last. The Ainu weren't pushed to Hokkaido because they were foreign. They were pushed there because they were original. But the Ainu story doesn't end with genetics, because what happened to them after the Yayoi expansion is just as revealing. Beginning in the Meiji era, the Japanese government implemented forced assimilation policies, banning the Ainu language, confiscating their land, and legally reclassifying them as former aborigines. For over a century, the policy was cultural erasure, and it nearly succeeded. It wasn't until 2008 that Japan's parliament formally recognized the Ainu as an indigenous people for the first time. And in 2020, the Upopoi National Ainu Museum opened in Hokkaido, the first national institution dedicated to preserving Ainu culture. But the genetic work has added a new dimension. It proved that the Ainu aren't a curiosity or an anomaly. They're the oldest continuous thread in the Japanese genetic tapestry. And when that thread is placed beside the full genetic history of the Japanese islands, the picture changes entirely. Every person in Japan today carries some portion of Genome DNA. The Ainu simply carry more of it than anyone else. The face that European scientists once called Caucasian was the face of the oldest known population of Japan, not a transplant from anywhere else. The mistake wasn't just getting the Ainu wrong, it was assuming that appearance tells you where someone comes from. Across the globe, unrelated populations have evolved similar features under similar pressures, and none of those parallels indicate shared bloodlines. The Ainu language, their oral traditions, their art, their spiritual practices, none of these came from Europe either. The Ainu language is a language isolate, unrelated to Japanese, Korean, or any other known language family. And linguists studying it haven't found reliable connections to any language spoken anywhere in Europe, reinforcing what the DNA already showed. Their identity, their genetics, their language, every line of evidence converges on the same conclusion. The Ainu were never European. They were East Asian before the label existed, before the Yayoi arrived, before rice paddies replaced the forests, before anyone drew a line between races at all. So, what else might we be getting wrong when we judge ancestry by appearance? The Ainu case isn't unique. It is just the most dramatic example of how badly morphology can mislead. From the Tarim mummies of China to Cheddar Man in England, the pattern repeats. The face doesn't tell you where someone comes from. Appearance is not ancestry, and the tools to prove that difference have only existed for about 20 years. Every year, more ancient genomes are being sequenced, and with each one, the old classification systems crack a little further. The Ainu are still here. Their DNA didn't come from Europe. Their culture didn't borrow from the West. Their language doesn't connect to any known family. They're the descendants of the people who were here first, and the science that proved it also proved how little we can trust our eyes. If you want to check the evidence yourself, every source cited in this video is linked in the description below. If the Ainu weren't what they appeared to be, how many other populations are still being judged by the same broken framework? Subscribe, because the next case is already open.